All right, folks, another month, another Q&A session, and I just want to give a very special thank you to all of my friends over on the Patreon. This month definitely beats any other previous month for number of questions received, so we're going to cover a bunch of them here and a bunch of them I replied to over there. So thank you so much. This really is one of my favorite things to do. It gets me thinking. It lets me know what you guys are thinking about. So very important. So with that, let's get into the cues. Callie asked about flower essences. This is a really cool topic. It's not something I talk about very much. I probably will do a class on this just because she brought it up and I think it'll be fun to talk about. So yes, I do work with flower essences in my practice. I don't generally make them myself. But I definitely bring them in, especially with some of my allies that are not safe to consume directly. And I really like when we do our community plant spirit journeys every month to work with the physical aspect of the plant through tincture or however we're working that month, but also through the flower essences. I will sometimes just put a couple of drops into my water bottle for the day and just really carry that slow, quiet energy of the plants with me, and I really enjoy it. I will say that here in the States where I am, I like to support FES, Flower Essence Society. They make my favorite essences stateside because they work with plants that are grown here, and I really also appreciate the ritual that they do around it. And then, of course, if you're in the UK or Europe, Bach would be probably a better choice. So lots of different folks out there making flower essences. They are very easy and accessible to make. They require very few ingredients, and they're a really cool way to connect to the plant spirits. One thing I'm going to note here, we did a book review recently with Christopher Penczak on his book, The Plant Spirit Familiar, and he has an entire section in that book about his work with flower essences. So highly recommended read. Thank you, Callie, for the awesome question. Next up, Ryan asks, how do you mindfully practice your herbalism and root them in your ancestral traditions while still respecting and honoring the indigenous practices and living traditions of where you live? Very important question, very good question. Thanks, Ryan, for that. So for me, I think the short answer is I really try to stay in my lane. If I'm invited into medicine spaces by indigenous folk, then I will, of course, show up and bring everything that I've got. But more often than not, I am trying to embody the herb-wise ways of my ancestors where I am now. And the place where my ancestors came from and the place where I live now, two different places, right? So I think a lot of us are in that situation. So, there are many nuances and angles to this. One of them being that sometimes the plants that grow really well where I am, that are either native or nativized or naturalized, are not the same ones that will be spoken about in the lore of my ancestors around plants. So sometimes I try to figure out how to create a bridge there, or just work with what I can grow in my gardens. And, occasionally I will have the privilege of getting to learn about plants from folks from this place that have been here forever, that have been working with these plants forever. And I take that transmission of wisdom really seriously. And generally, if I do apply it in my practice, I apply it quietly and privately so that it doesn't look like something that I'm representing or anything like that. When I've been gifted information or ritual in that way, I assume that it's to be kept private for me, and it's not something that I should teach other people or represent, so I don't. But I think that this brings me back to the thing that we talk about all the time, which is relationship. That we can enter into personal relationships with plants and learn directly from them. And sometimes that green gnosis is edified by what we end up learning. Folks that are indigenous to the place where we live have also learned from those plants. And sometimes it's really different. Both of those things I find really interesting, by the way. So the relationship is really what's important. That when we enter into relationship with these plants that grow around us, that may or may not be reflected in our ancestral lore, that may or may not be plants that our ancestors would ever have worked with, and that may be plants that are incredibly important and incredibly wrapped up in the lore and folkways and rituals of indigenous people. When the relationship is on point, generally, we're less likely to act in a way that could be harmful or offensive. And that relationship is really personal. So we're also less likely to represent or appropriate information that's not ours to teach. It's a very nuanced topic. And I think that there's probably not one answer that will cover every situation. There are definitely, as an example, to wrap this up, there are plants that I personally don't work with because of the way that those plants get treated in commerce, in market, and the way that those plants are and have been since forever a deep part of indigenous practices. So like I could use white sage, for example, or Palo Santo, or Harape, right? There are like all these examples. But I also have examples of those plants where people that I know who are non-indigenous, who are settlers or descendants or whatever, have entered into a personal relationship with those plants. And so the relationship is there in a way that's unique to that individual, in a plant that also has a really deep eternal relationship with a group of people that have been stewarding and connecting with that plant forever. And generally, kind of like I said already, those relationships tend to be a little more private, right? Like even if I were in relationship to, let's say, white sage, which I'm not, white sage does grow where I live, but not anywhere near me. And it's just not a plant that I've really connected with. You would not see me posting about it. You would not see me burning white sage in my YouTube videos or on Instagram or in public rituals. It would be something I would keep private because I'm aware of the way that that plant has been mistreated and misappropriated and over harvested. And so I would, even if I was in relationship with that plant, I would be very delicate about how I held that space and how I represent it. So hopefully that's helpful. I know it's all over the place. Again, it's so nuanced and so delicate, and it's worth thinking about, and it's worth really considering what's appropriate and what's not appropriate, and it's worth listening to indigenous folks talk about their relationship with plants and how, as non-indigenous people, we can be supportive of that as much as possible. I think always about what I have learned from reading and sitting in classes with Robin Wall Kimmerer. I think that her voice is kind of always what comes into my head when I think about how to tread lightly in those spaces. So yeah, thanks. Great question. Glad that folks are thinking about this. Next up, Donald. What are some appropriate steps to take to be in right relationship with and build a deeper connection to the land spirits and all the spirits of place? Also, do you ever work with animal spirits in conjunction to the plant spirits you are working with? Awesome question. Let me give you a book suggestion first and foremost. Anything from Claude Lecouteux, and I will actually put that down in the video details below because his name's a little difficult. So Claude Lecouteux books, lots of the way that I approach my work with spirits of place, of land spirits, comes from him. And it's interesting, this kind of dovetails with the previous question from Ryan about the fact that I interact with land spirits through the folklore of my ancestors of the British Isles. So I consider the Alf and the Fae when I dovetail with them, which is a really different perspective than maybe the indigenous folks of this place might approach them. So there's room for both, right? It just has to be done in a really respectful way. So my big thing is considering the way that spirits of place interact with my gardens, right? That when I'm stewarding plants, when I'm inviting plants to come grow in my gardens, my raised beds, and the pots in the front, whatever, that there are spirits who live in those spaces full time. So when I'm out there gardening and harvesting and talking to plants and all of that, I'm even a guest in those spaces, right? Because when I come back inside the house, there are beings, insects and animals who are always living in that space, but there are also those non-human land spirits who I consider very much protectors and guardians of the green. I have always felt that working with plants in any capacity is a very fey art, that it is very wrapped up in the fairy, the good folk, the neighbors, the elf, because those spirits, constantly in the folklore, we see them haunting and haunting through groves and trees and gardens and flowers. And so there's really this awareness that they're so connected. So always acknowledging them, burning some incense for them or pouring a libation for them before I take harvest or bring in new plants. I do like to use the full moon as an opportunity to go out and just honor the spirits of place, pour a little libation or smolder some incense for them, to thank them for sharing their space with me, for helping us to keep peace and health and plenty and harmony in these spaces. And I think it goes a long way. I have not, as of yet in my life, forged really deep personal connections with like an individual land spirit, like that we've come into really, deep personal connection. I think if I channeled my energy in that direction, I probably could, but I am very, very wrapped up in working with the plants. So that tends to be the case. I have certainly had experiences with them that have strengthened my need to honor them and strengthen the fact that they are here and that they are doing their thing around me and sometimes in spite of me. So that awareness is there, but my personal work with them is more, I guess, general honoring them, general acknowledging them, trying to tread lightly in spaces, trying to heed the warnings of the folklore that's there, and really just thanking them for being part of my practice through being guardians of the land and of the plants. And the way that so much of the lore of land spirit is wrapped up in plant lore, it's very interesting. So if this is something that's interesting to you, there's a lot of room to kind of hold both in your hand at the same time, right? They play well together. Awesome question, Donald. Thank you. Here's a two-part, because Sharon asked a really good question and then Stecky sort of followed up on that question. So this is both. So Sharon asked, I read in Paul Barrel's book to never use metal with herbs, as in don't decoct them in a metal pan, don't steep them in a metal container, don't ever strain them in a metal mesh strainer. He mentions the herbs interacting with metal to create dangerous substances. I've been using stainless steel pots and a stainless steel French press, and even glass French presses have metal frame for strainer. So now I'm concerned, what are your thoughts on using metal? I feel like there are probably some botanical substances that might react a little bit to metal, but it's not going to be the higher quality metals that we work with, our stainless steels, our kitchen metals. Really, the only substance that I've ever worked with and had problems with metal is vinegar. Making fire cider and not paying attention and not putting a piece of parchment or wax paper between the lid and the liquid, and seeing what the acidity of the vinegar, how it ate away at the lid and then turned the vinegar gross, right? So I think there are substances in our practice that would make sense to not have metal, but I work with metal. I like that it's easy to clean. I like that it's easy to sterilize. In the apothecary, when I'm making medicine for the community, we're always working with stainless steel because we can clean it properly. I definitely love glass too. A lot of Pyrex, all of my measuring cups, everything with spouts is all Pyrex or glass. Again, a type of glass that can be sterilized. It can be run through a dishwasher or submerged into hot water. That's important to me when I'm making medicine for people. So on the physical level, I don't think you need to worry too much. I probably would not make a tincture or an oil, macerate something in metal. I feel like that's too much exposure. And if there was going to be a problem, that's where the problem would be. But running things through a mesh strainer or making tea, the French press having that metal mesh, it's just not enough contact to cause problems, in my opinion. And maybe on some level it's there, but I just don't see it. So that's the physical level. There's a preference for glass for me, but metal's fine. Then we go into like the energetic level. So Stecky says, my question is similar to Sharon's, but regards tools you discuss in the green art. Fortunately, since I live in a city ordinance neighborhood, I have to push a lawnmower around to avoid getting a yellow notice stuck to my front door. Plus, I have some great wood carving knives, which I used to turn scrounged yard cuttings, such as maple branches, tossed to the curb in the neighborhood into spoons, spatulas, and so on. That's very cool. Plus, I use shovels and forks to replace my lawn with native pollinator plants, etc. So a lot of no-till gardening. Stecky's bringing up garden tools, right? And I do the same. Pretty much all my tools are some form of metal. And so the point that I'm trying to drive home in the green art is more in a ritual setting, and especially harvest, right? That when we approach a plant with a sharp metal object, a forged or honed object, we have to be aware of how those objects are generally used in relation to plants, like this really mindless cutting, bulldozing, turning the land to build a parking lot. And also in the folklore, which tends to be specifically ferrous metals like iron, that the Fae, the good folk, which ties into Donald's question, this happens every month, right? We always have these interesting patterns. That the Fae, the good folk, the elf, the land spirits, tend not to like ferrous metals. There are lots of different reasons why this is brought up in the folklore. Sometimes it's said that iron is symbolic of the human animal, and that the iron metal is dispersive or disruptive to the subtle energy of these non-human persons like the fairy, the elf. Sometimes it is said in lore that these ferrous metals, because of their association with war and fighting and battle, are offensive to the more gentle race, and so they don't like them for that reason. So it's not really a hard and fast rule. It's more an invitation to be mindful that as we approach plants with these tools, that the plants have an awareness, right? And that we should try to carry the tools and store the tools with some mindfulness. I mentioned in the book that I keep my scissors and my cutting tools wrapped, right? They stay in a drawer, and some of them are in little cloth sheaths as sort of an homage to the plant, saying these will be used for creation and not destruction, right? And in the garden, I avoid iron tools just because I like to honor the folklore. I think there's reasons why those stories have been passed down. So, stainless steel or different kinds of steel alloys in my materials. And again, that's pretty specific to ritual work. If I had to use an iron shears to prune a tree so they could be healthy or remove some material, I would, but I would not be invoking, and working in a ritual space in the same way with those kinds of metals there, because the disruptive energy of those metals, I don't want that in my ritual. But otherwise, I think if we're just peaceful and calm, and if we're going to remove a plant or dig up some space, that we communicate that. That's what I do, right? It's really just this very brief, like, hey everyone, I need to move some soil around here. This is why I'm going to take care of it the best I can. May it be done in wisdom and peace, right? And so I'm acknowledging that other people inhabit that space, and that I'm about to come in with my tools and change that space that is home to people. So I'm kind of stating my intent and kind of asking for permission and for their guidance. And there have been times that I'm about to do work like that, and I've gotten a pretty distinct feeling that I should not, and I honor that. I leave it. So the metal thing, it's worth consideration, but don't get too hung up on it, especially if it's not in a ritual context. Good question, Sharon Stecky. Thanks for those. Adrian asking, how do you honor those plants or trees that have died or passed on? Really good question. I really think that putting the material to use as best we can is important. One of my favorite working tools that I've made, which is one of my staffs, actually you can see it behind me right there. came from a tree that was snapped during a windstorm here. And so we went and harvested a bunch of material from this big birch tree, from that birch, and tried to put as much of that material into magical use as can. We made some really beautiful wreaths with the leaves, the really viney leaves of the birch, the weepy vines. And again, I have that staff and the bit of juniper wood that I wear around my neck also came from a juniper tree that I don't know why, but it was part of the stand that I visit all the time. And that particular tree just died. It didn't come back after a winter growth. And so I have some jewelry made from that tree and made a lot of incense and things from that tree. So I think if we can put their material to use medicinally or magically or through art, or making tools, or even just drying them out and using them in a fire, using them in maybe a ritual fire or a bonfire that we gather around with our friends, or putting them to use in the garden as making bee hotels or beehives, or building up compost or mulch. I really think that's one of the most respectful things we can do, instead of just throwing it all in the brown bin or whatever. And sometimes that's the right thing to do, right? Is just to compost the material or run it through a wood chipper and turn it back into the garden and give that material new life, so to speak. Of course, if you're in relationship to that plant and you were gathering food or medicine or magical supplies, or that was a tree that you sat under and enjoyed their shade, I think some words of gratitude and an offering to that spirit, or just sharing some memories is good. A little eulogy of sorts to honor them, to be aware that that spirit has just pulled themselves back from that location, right? That the spirit of that plant still exists in all their different manifestations, right? The way that I approach this work and experience this work, for example, is that all chamomile plants are one spirit, right? They're not each individual different spirits. They're all the chamomile spirit expressing themselves in different times and places, which is why chamomile in Greece and chamomile in my backyard have the same virtues, the same medicine, the same personality. The folklore applies because it's the same person that's there. It's one of the bits of their mystery. So I really like that idea, and I like giving them due honor, and I think putting their material to use in an intentional way is really respected. Last one that we'll do here, looking at time, from Callie: have you ever used plant spirits to connect and align specific chakras in the body? Not chakras, that's not something that I know much about, but definitely the three energy centers that I work with, the head, the heart, and the base, the three cauldrons of power in the body. When I do the practice of following the medicine, which there's a bunch of that on the YouTube here that I talk about, where we take herbal medicine, usually in a microdose, and really just follow it through the body, see where it moves. I'm very mindful of how that plant spirit is able to access those three energy spaces. And when that spirit is moving into that part of my body, does the cauldron feel full or empty? Does it feel hot or cold? Does it feel upright or downward turned? And can I invite that plant spirit to help me fill or replenish that cauldron within my body? So there are definitely some alchemical, sorcerous potentials here for taking internal medicine, especially a plant that you're close with or a plant that's relevant for what you're doing, and asking them to move through those various energy spaces, whether it's chakras or cauldrons or however you look at it, and asking you to do work or explore the state of those places and give some insight into what needs to be done. I think all of that is super relevant, and I love that internal work, right? I really love, you'll see that through a lot of the guided meditations I do and stuff. I love that, invoking the plant spirit into my physical body through the medium of tincture, for example, and then doing internal work with them, sitting with them inside of myself and seeing what has to be, where there's attention needed, and then giving that attention. So hopefully that's helpful. Thank you guys again so much. Really fantastic questions this month. We put the call out on the 20th of every month. You've got about a week or so to submit your questions, and then you see the answers right here. With that, I look forward to seeing what you guys come up with next month. Thank you so much for the support. See you soon.